two souls in one body. When you're 54 years old, the last thing you expect is to discover that your entire life has been built on a lie. That the man you've always called father is genetically a stranger to you. That blood from someone you've never met flows through your veins. I opened my DNA test results on a cool October morning, sipping chamomile tea and expecting to see the usual mix. Some German heritage, a touch of English, maybe something Irish thrown in. Instead, the first line hit me like lightning. One of your parents is likely not your biological parent. The cup nearly slipped from my trembling hands. I read the sentence again and again, hoping the words would somehow magically change. But they remained the same, merciless in their scientific precision. My name is Elizabeth Marlowe. Until that moment, I was absolutely certain of who I was. And now, at an age when other people worry about retirement plans and joint health, I've suddenly discovered I didn't even know my own origins. But let me start from the very beginning. With a childhood that seemed like the perfect example of American family life. I was born in 1967 in a small town in Pennsylvania, where life flowed at a measured, predictable pace. My father, or the man I thought was my father, Joseph Marlowe, taught physics at the local college. A tall, slightly stooped man with kind eyes behind thick, horn-rimmed glasses and eternally tousled gray hair. His shirts were always a bit wrinkled, and his pockets forever jingled with keys and small pieces of scientific equipment. Dad had a rare gift. He could explain the most complex laws of physics in simple terms. He compared quantum mechanics to a dance of invisible particles, and the theory of relativity to a journey on a magical time train. Students adored his lectures, and I was proud that this amazing man was my father. Mom, Joan, worked as a school librarian, a quiet, wise woman with a gentle voice and hands that always smelled of old book pages. She wore long floral skirts and soft cardigans, never raised her voice, and knew hundreds of poems by heart. Our house was a true temple of knowledge, a Victorian two-story building with bookshelves literally everywhere, floor to ceiling in the living room, along the staircase, even in the bathroom. In the corner stood an antique piano where Mom played classics every evening, the music mingling with the crackling of the fireplace. Every day at exactly 5:30, Dad would brew chamomile tea, and we'd sit in the living room for our sacred family ritual. Instead of fairy tales, he told me about stars, black holes, and the mysteries of the universe. His eyes would light up with a special glow when he explained the laws of nature, and I absorbed every word. Dad called me his firefly. He said I illuminated his world, just like those little bugs light up summer evenings. Every weekend, we'd drive to the planetarium, where we'd lie back in reclining seats, under an artificial starry sky, while he whispered the names of constellations and ancient myths about them. I inherited his love of mysteries and science, his habit of asking questions about everything, even his way of tugging at his hair when pondering a complex problem. We were incredibly close. When asked at school who I wanted to be like, I always answered, Dad. Never, not for a second, did I doubt who I was or where I came from. I was the daughter of Joseph and Joan Marlowe, granddaughter of farmers from Iowa on Dad's side and descendant of Irish immigrants on Mom's. This was my story, my identity, my anchor in this world. Until science burst into my orderly life like a destructive hurricane. It all started with an innocent birthday gift. My husband, David, always loved giving unusual presents. On my 54th birthday, he handed me a small box with a genetic company logo, a home DNA test kit. David explained with a mischievous smile that he knew my love for solving mysteries, and now I could learn about my roots, maybe find distant relatives in Europe. I laughed. Of course, why not? All my friends were already into these tests. One found a cousin in Ireland. Another discovered a tendency toward lactose intolerance. A third found Polish roots instead of the expected German ones. These discoveries seemed more amusing than serious. I sent off the saliva sample and forgot about it for several weeks. Life went on as usual. Work at the local library, where I'd become head librarian after the previous director's retirement. Evenings with grandchildren, coffee dates with friends, theater trips with my husband. Then came that fateful morning. An email notification. Results ready. I brewed chamomile tea, exactly as Dad had done all his life, settled into my favorite chair by the window with my laptop, and expected to see something predictable. Instead, my world collapsed in 1 second. One of your parents is likely not your biological parent. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. My hands broke out in cold sweat. I scrolled down to the DNA matches section, where my parents should have been listed. Mom was there. Joan Marlowe, 50% match, absolutely normal for a parent and child. But Dad wasn't there. Not at all. Not a single Joseph Marlowe in the matches list, as if he didn't exist for my DNA. It felt like being hit with a sledgehammer in the solar plexus. The air seemed to vanish from my lungs. How was this possible? He's my father. He held me as a newborn, fed me from bottles at night, taught me to walk, patiently supporting my little hands. He cried with pride at my graduation, walked me down the aisle at my wedding, babysat my children. How could he not be my biological father? I immediately called the genetic company's customer service, hoping to hear that there'd been an error, a system glitch, something explainable and fixable. A woman with a professionally neutral voice listened to my agitated speech and told me exactly what I feared hearing. Their tests are very accurate. If I see a message about lack of biological relationship, it means exactly what it says. Errors in such cases are extremely rare, less than 1%. I didn't sleep at all that night. I lay in bed next to my peacefully sleeping husband, staring at the ceiling, with the same tormenting questions spinning in my head. Who am I really? If Joseph Marlowe isn't my biological father, then who is? Did Mom know about this? How long had she kept the secret? And most importantly, what did this mean for everything I believed about myself and my family? By morning, I felt like a wrung-out dish rag, but my decision was made. I had to talk to Mom. Dialing her number was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. My hands shook, my voice trembled. How do you ask your own mother about such a delicate matter? How do you start a conversation that could destroy everything you knew about each other? Mom immediately sensed something was wrong. She always had amazing intuition about my moods, even over the phone. I heard concern in her voice when she asked what had happened. I told her about the test, about the shocking results, about Dad not appearing in the genetic matches. I spoke slowly, carefully, as if each word was a landmine that could explode. After my words, there was a long, heavy silence. I could only hear the ticking of the clock in Mom's kitchen and my own heartbeat, which seemed loud enough to be heard on the other end of the line. Finally, Mom spoke. Her voice sounded tired, but surprisingly calm. She said she understood how frightening and painful this sounded, and that she would tell me all the truth she knew herself. And then I heard, for the first time, a story I'd never suspected, a story of pain, hope, and medical miracle. It turned out that my parents had struggled to conceive for a long time. Years of trying, endless doctor visits, tests, examinations, disappointments. Dad had serious reproductive system problems, and doctors gave practically no hope for natural conception. In the late 60s, when reproductive medicine was just developing, they turned to a university clinic conducting an experimental research program for treating infertility. My parents became participants in this research. They underwent numerous tests, had karyotypes done, went through various experimental procedures, but all of this was aimed at treating them as a couple without using donor material. And then, completely unexpectedly, against all medical predictions, Mom got pregnant. Doctors called it a true miracle, a long-awaited, hard-won miracle. Mom spoke with such conviction that I felt the tension in my chest ease slightly. She was absolutely certain. This was my dad. 100%. She had never doubted it then, and didn't doubt it now. But if she was right, why did the test show otherwise? What was happening here? What secret was hidden in our family history? The next few days passed in a fog. I couldn't concentrate at work, slept poorly. Not on Dad's side, not on Mom's. I wrote him a cautious message, explaining the situation as delicately as possible. Our DNA showed a family connection, but I couldn't understand the nature of this connection. And could he help figure it out? Brian turned out to be a pleasant and responsive man. A 64-year-old retired engineer from a small town in Ohio. He had 2 adult children and 4 grandchildren. He was into genealogy and was just as puzzled by our unexpected match as I was. We began comparing family trees, trying to find common roots. Brian had only one sister who had died 10 years ago from cancer. He'd never had brothers. His parents bore the surname Kent and had lived their entire lives in Ohio, working on a local farm. No intersections with Marlow, Pennsylvania, or the academic world. Brian suggested it might be a system error, though he'd read that such tests were usually quite accurate. The more I studied information about genetic research, the more convinced I became of their reliability, especially when it came to such large matches. Then I realized I needed help from a specialist, someone who understood the intricacies of genetics and could explain this puzzle. Dr. Elizabeth Kane saw patients at the Genetic Center at the University Hospital. A woman in her 60s with perceptive eyes and a calm, confident voice. She specialized in rare genetic phenomena and counseled people who encountered unexpected DNA test results. Her office smelled of antiseptic and coffee. The walls were covered with diplomas and scientific articles, and on the desk stood photographs of children, probably patients she'd helped solve genetic puzzles. I told Dr. Kane my entire story, in detail, omitting nothing, about the test and shocking results, about the lack of match with Dad and the strange appearance of Uncle Brian, about Mom's stories of the research program and miraculous conception, about my certainty that Dad was my real father, despite contradictory data. Dr. Kane listened very attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions about family history details and test results. When I finished, she was silent for several minutes, clearly thinking over what she'd heard and analyzing possible explanations. Finally, she offered a hypothesis that seemed completely fantastic to me. Perhaps, she said, my father was a chimera. I didn't understand what that meant. The word chimera made me think of mythological creatures, monsters with a lion's head, goat's body, and snake's tail. Dr. Kane patiently explained this rare but quite real genetic phenomenon to me. At the very earliest stage of embryonic development, literally in the first days after conception, an amazing event sometimes occurs: the fusion of two separately fertilized eggs. Instead of developing two embryos that could become twins, one forms. But this single embryo carries the genetic material of both original cells. The result? One person, one personality, one consciousness, but with two different sets of DNA in different body tissues. Skin and saliva cells might have one genetic code, while reproductive cells have a completely different one. Such a person is literally their own twin at the genetic level. I listened to this explanation like fascinating science fiction. Was such a thing really possible? Dr. Kane nodded. Chimerism occurs rarely, perhaps one case in several thousand people. But it exists and is well documented in medical literature. Moreover, many people might be chimeras and not suspect it, since in ordinary life it doesn't manifest at all. If my father was indeed a chimera, and I inherited DNA from his second genetic set, the one present in reproductive cells but absent in saliva, then a standard test wouldn't find a match. The algorithm would compare my DNA with DNA from Dad's saliva, find no relationship, and conclude he wasn't my biological father. Although he actually was, just through his second genetic line. Gradually, I began to grasp the stunning meaning of this hypothesis. Like pieces of a complex puzzle, all the oddities of my situation began forming a logical picture. But what about Brian, this mysterious uncle from Ohio, who suddenly appeared in my genetic matches? Dr. Kane suggested he was most likely a cousin or other close relative of precisely that second genetic line of my father, the one that gave me life. DNA analysis algorithms detected a high percentage of match between us and interpreted it as an uncle-niece connection. But actually, the relationship was more complex and indirect. I sat in the chair across from Dr. Kane and felt incredible relief washing over my body, as if a huge stone I'd been carrying in my heart for the past weeks had suddenly dissolved and disappeared. The fog of uncertainty was clearing, revealing a clear and amazing picture. The doctor explained that for final confirmation of the hypothesis, we could take DNA samples from different tissues of Dad's. For example, from cells of the inner cheek surface and hair follicles. If he was indeed a chimera, the analysis results could differ noticeably. But I no longer needed additional proof. I understood what had happened, and that understanding was enough. Logic, science, and maternal intuition converged at one point, indicating the truth. That same day, I went to see Dad. He was 82 years old. He still lived in our family home, that same Victorian two-story building where my childhood had passed. Though now, he spent most of his time in his study on the first floor. Mom found it hard to climb stairs because of arthritis, and they'd set up a cozy place for Dad among his beloved scientific journals and books. the study had practically unchanged over the decades. The same floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, crammed with physics, mathematics, and astronomy references. The same old darkwood desk where creative disorder of papers, calculations, pens and pencils always reigned. On the walls hung photographs from scientific conferences, diplomas, thank you notes from students. I found Dad in his favorite rocking chair, a gift from Mom for his 60th birthday. He was reading a thick quantum mechanics handbook, running a large magnifying glass over the lines. His eyesight was failing, but age hadn't weakened his thirst for knowledge, seeing me. He set aside the magnifying glass and smiled that special smile he reserved only for me. It held so much warmth and love that my heart squeezed with tenderness. I sat on the couch next to his chair, in the same spot where I'd once listened to his stories about stars and planets. My heart was beating like crazy. How do you explain to someone that two different genetic souls might live within them? How do you tell a father he might be his own twin? Dad immediately sensed my agitation. He set aside his book and looked at me attentively, studying my facial expression with the same scientific interest he'd once used to examine complex physics formulas. I told him everything, slowly, in detail, giving him time to absorb each element of this incredible story. About the DNA test that was supposed to be amusing entertainment, but turned into a source of family drama. About the shocking results showing we didn't match genetically. About mysterious Brian from Ohio, who unexpectedly turned out to be my uncle. About the visit to Dr. Kane and her astounding explanation, chimerism. I told him that two different sets of DNA might coexist in his body, that one was present in saliva and most tissues, while the other was in reproductive cells, and that precisely this second set had given me life, making me his biological daughter, though undetectable by standard tests. Dad listened with the same concentrated attention he'd once used to study scientific articles about the latest discoveries in physics. He nodded occasionally, sometimes frowned while pondering what he'd heard. Sometimes he asked clarifying questions, still a scientist to the bone, accustomed to getting to the bottom of any phenomenon. When I finished, he was silent for a long time, looking out the window at the autumn trees in our garden. The maples blazed red and gold, exactly as I remembered them from childhood. Time passed, changing us, but leaving these small miracles of nature unchanged. Finally, Dad turned to me and took my hands in his warm, wrinkled palms. Hands that had once taught me to tie shoelaces, hold a pen, solve math problems. In his eyes I saw not surprise or confusion, but some amazing tranquility, as if this story hadn't shocked him, but, on the contrary, explained something important he'd long felt but couldn't articulate. He told me he'd never known about the possibility of chimerism and hadn't suspected such a feature of his organism. But he confessed something that amazed me. He'd always felt that I was a special, unique part of his being. Not just a daughter, but something bigger and deeper, as if I'd been born not simply from his flesh, but from the very heart of his soul. And if two genetic lines indeed lived within him, and one of them had given me life, this only confirmed that feeling of special connection he'd experienced toward me from the moment of my birth. I was and remained his child, his firefly, forever and unconditionally. Tears flowed down my cheeks, but these were tears not of pain, but of incredible relief, joy, and love. All that horror of uncertainty that had tormented me for the past weeks vanished without a trace. I knew again who I was. I was the daughter of this amazing man, albeit in a more complex, scientifically interesting way than I'd thought before. In the following months, I immersed myself in studying chimerism. It turned out this phenomenon was much more widespread and diverse than commonly believed. Various types of chimerism exist, from simple microchimerism, when a mother's organism retains cells from a child after pregnancy, to complex cases of complete embryo fusion. Some scientists believe many of us might be chimeras to some degree. We just don't know it. In ordinary life, it doesn't manifest at all and is discovered only through special genetic research. I read fascinating stories of other people who'd experienced similar situations. A woman from Canada who couldn't prove maternity of her own children until it was discovered that her ovaries contained DNA different from the DNA in her blood. A man from Germany who spent decades searching for his real father, then learned he was searching for himself, the second half of his genetic self. These stories showed me I wasn't alone in my experience, that science can present the most incredible surprises, and family connections can turn out much more complex and amazing than we suppose. I contacted Brian and told him about our conclusions. He was absolutely delighted with such an unusual explanation for our relationship. In his understanding, it turned out he was uncle to one part of my father. Definitely the strangest and most unique family connection he'd ever heard of. We began corresponding regularly, and it turned out we really had a lot in common. Love of reading science fiction, interest in astronomy, even similar character traits, tendency toward reflection, curiosity, a certain introversion. Perhaps this was the heritage of that very genetic line connecting us through Dad. Brian sent me photographs of his parents, the grandmother and grandfather of one part of my father. Surprisingly, I saw something familiar in his mother's features. The shape of eyebrows, the cut of eyes, even the way of holding her head slightly tilted. Everything reminded me of Dad, and therefore of me. A few months later, Brian came to visit us. The meeting was exciting and a bit surreal. Here he was, my uncle, a relative through a genetic line whose existence we discovered by chance. A man connected to me by ancient DNA chains stretching through generations of ancestors. But most amazing was watching how Dad and Brian communicated with each other. Some special connection immediately arose between them. They could talk for hours about technology, science, books. They discovered similar views on life, comparable senses of humor, even identical gestures and expressions. Watching them, I understood I was seeing a meeting of two parts of one genetic story. Dad was in some sense meeting his own past, the roots of one of his genetic lines, and Brian saw in Dad a reflection of his family heritage surviving to our days in unexpected form. Now, nearly 2 years have passed since that October morning that changed my understanding of family and heredity. I often reflect on what happened, on the strange path by which modern science led me to a deeper understanding of love and family connections. I realized that family is much more than just DNA and genetic matches. It's love manifested in daily actions. It's care that doesn't depend on laboratory analysis results. It's shared memories, values, traditions. It's the person who reads to you about stars at night and calls you Firefly. It's hands that support you when you're learning to ride a bicycle. It's eyes that shine with pride at your graduation. Dad remains my father. It doesn't matter how many genetic lines combine in his organism, or which one gave me life. He chose to be my father every day for 54 years. He shaped my personality, passed on knowledge and values, loved me unconditionally and selflessly. And if blood from two different genetic histories really flows in me through my chimera father, this only makes my life story even more amazing and unique. I'm the daughter not of one, but of two lineages. Memory of not one, but two family lines lives in my cells. Perhaps that's why I always felt some special inner complexity within myself. Why I was simultaneously drawn to science and art, to solitude and communication, to the stability of family life and the urge for new discoveries. Maybe these are manifestations of different genetic heritages, intertwined in one personality by fate and the miracle of embryonic development. Now, when I look at Dad, I see in him not just one person, but an entire universe of possibilities. Two people who could once have been born as separate twins, but fate united them in one body, and one of them became my father through a complex, scientifically incredible, but nonetheless absolutely real connection. This is a scientific miracle, biological fantasy that became my family's reality. But at the same time, it's simply love. The most ordinary human parental love that needs no scientific explanations and doesn't depend on laboratory analyses. Every evening when I brew chamomile tea, I think about Dad, about how he did the same thing for decades, not suspecting the amazing secret of his organism, about how DNA from two different people might live in his hands. But the love in them was and remains one, boundless, constant, unchanging. And when my own grandchildren ask me about our family history, I tell them not only about ordinary great-great-grandmothers and great-great-grandfathers, but also about the amazing secret of their great-great-grandfather, about how two genetic origins can coexist in one person, but one big loving heart. They listen with the same wide-open eyes with which I once listened to Dad's stories about the mysteries of the universe. And in those childish gazes, I see the same thirst for understanding, the same desire to solve the puzzles of the world that my parents once instilled in me. 7-year-old Emma once asked me if it meant that two different people lived in a great-great-grandfather. I answered her, gently stroking her head, that one person lived in him. Just a very special, unique person, with two sets of genetic memories, two lines of family history, two streams of heredity, but with one heart that loves us all. And that's the truth. The most important, most crucial truth I learned during these months of searching, doubts, and discoveries. Fatherhood isn't percentage matches in a computer program. It's not numbers in a genetic report or the quantity of identical chromosomes. Fatherhood is the daily choice to love, despite everything, against any scientific data, and regardless of laboratory research results. It's the decision to be there in difficult moments, to support when the world seems hostile, to protect when protection is needed, to teach, sharing knowledge and experience, to inspire new discoveries and achievements. It's the ability to see in a child not just a continuation of your genes, but a unique personality worthy of unconditional love and acceptance. Dad made this choice every day of my life, from my birth to today. And it doesn't matter what secrets his cells kept. It doesn't matter how many genetic stories intertwined in his organism. It doesn't matter what algorithms and what percentages computer programs showed. Only one thing matters. He loved me. Completely, fully, unconditionally, with his entire being, with all his genetic lines, with his whole big, kind heart. And I remain his firefly, and always will be, because the most beautiful secrets of life aren't those hidden in laboratory test tubes and scientific reports, but those that live in human hearts. And Dad's heart always belonged to me, however complex the structure of his body and the mysteries of his DNA might have been. Two genetic souls in one body gave me life, but only one loved me, that one unique, irreplaceable soul of my father. And that's more than enough for an entire lifetime full of happiness, understanding, and boundless gratitude. After all, we're all products of incredible scientific miracles. Each of us is the result of millions of years of evolution, countless genetic combinations, amazing biological processes. But what makes us truly human isn't our DNA, but our ability to love and be loved. And in that sense, I'm the most ordinary person in the world. A daughter who loves her father, a father who loves his daughter. Everything else is just science. Amazing, fascinating, but still secondary compared to simple human love. Now that this whole story is behind me, I know for certain. It doesn't matter how many secrets our past holds, how many puzzles our genetics hides. What matters is what we choose to do with this knowledge, how we use it to become better, love stronger, understand deeper. My story is about how family can be much more complex and amazing than we think. But at the same time, it's a story about how love is much simpler and stronger than any scientific discoveries. And I'm grateful to fate that I got to learn this.